How to do this? Anyway, Dale's a former ESRI guy. He's social networking and all this modern day stuff. But he also, I think, can probably really relate to Rebecca's surveyor records, because my first vision of him was wearing a colonial era surveyor's costume or uniform or whatever it was.
I thought about it. I appreciate hearing Rebecca speak about this topic. We have some similarities and some differences. She comes at it definitely from an academic perspective. And to be honest with you, I'm just a guy who was looking for a road and wasn't willing to ask for directions. So I want to try to find, I'm from the Charlotte area, actually Union County, but the general Charlotte area, interested in history. And what I always hear is all the Scotch-Irish came down from Philadelphia, down the Great Wagon Road to Philadelphia, into that area. So it was a very prominent, very important road coming down into the Charlotte area. So I thought, I'd like to know where that is. And I thought, being such an important road, we would know where it is, that I would be able to go to a map somewhere and find it. I did look. This is a quote from Carl Breitenbaugh, 1952. He said, like most of our historic highways, the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, which has become almost a mythical name for this road, followed the meanderings of old Indian trails. Year after year, along this narrow, rutted, intercolonial thoroughfare, coursed a procession of horsemen, footmen, and pioneer families, with horse and wagon and cattle. In the last 16 years, the colonial area, southbound traffic along the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, or whatever the path was, numbered in the tens of thousands. It was the most heavily traveled road in all of America, and it had more vehicles jolting along its rough and tortuous way than all other main roads put together. Obviously a very important road then. So where is it? I'd like to go see it. I'd like to walk on it. I'd like to travel it. So I thought I could. I looked, actually much like Benson Lawson, who did this drawing about 100 years later, who believed that we were losing our colonial heritage, our knowledge of what happened in colonial times and during the Revolutionary War. And so he took a trip around the young nation and drew what he saw. So basically sort of photographic evidence with his pen and ink drawings. And I just wanted to see where these things were that he was drawing. And I wanted to go find it. So, not finding a modern data source that could tell me where the road was, I thought, well, I'll go back to some historic documents. So I went back to some of the oldest maps I could find of Carolina. This one's 1660. And you really don't find any information in the backcountry. Certainly not that early. But you see a lot of detail along the coast, some of it very generalized. You get to John Lawson's time, 1704, who did actually walk through the area. You see a little bit more detail, but it's still largely generalized in the backcountry. This is John Lamb's 1676, I think it was. This was an interesting piece of propaganda in Europe to get people to migrate here. I love this description of the desert area, the Great Savannah, all these things in Carolina. But one of the things that caught my eye was this line, a series of lines here, that come around here down to Lake Ashley, which is another interest of mine. But and back up this way, what is that line? And it took me quite a while before I ran across John Lederer's journal and his 3 marches through the Carolinas in 1672 to realize that the line in John Lamb's map is actually one of the paths that he took that came down basically into the Charlotte area, where he described the brackish water of this Lake Ashley. So it gets in some of the, what did you call it, the errors in data, uncertainties. But obviously this wasn't helping me to find where this trail was. I did discover that the Great Wagon Road came from the Great Warrior Path, an Indian trail that ran north-south, much like the trading path run east-west. And I thought, we should be able to, again, define where this road is. Now, my understanding or appreciation of Indian paths was very simplistic. I thought an Indian path looked something like this. Coming to find out, this is very much of a European idea of a path, as we walk with our feet shoulder width apart and make very wide paths. Where Indians, although this is the Appalachian Trail, Indians tend to walk heel and toe, and it's a very narrow path that isn't as easily discoverable or more easily lost. Continuing some of the information that I read about this Great Wagon Road and why I had such keen interest in this. I had an interest in the American Revolution, and a lot of things happened along the roadways. Not only is that where people lived, it's where people traveled, it's where events happen. As armies are traveling, it's where they meet each other. It's where all the interesting stuff happens is on the road. So I wanted to find the road that was described here by Park Rouse in his book on the Great Wagon Road. After the British forces captured Philadelphia early in the Revolution, Continental Congress escaped, fled down this Great Wagon Road to York, Pennsylvania. Cornwallis and his troops traveled the Wagon Road in their attempt to neutralize the southern colonies. Many important battles were fought on or near the road that became the war's western front. So places like Kings Mountain, the Cowpens, Guilford, that's the way they spelled it, Salisbury and Camden were just some of those. So there were a lot of important things that happened along the road. It was a very important road in and of itself. So where was it? How can I find it today? So, lacking any real resources today to find it, I had to go back to historic documents. This is one of the earliest maps. This is Collett's map of 1770. And you really can't see it, but there are some paths drawn in here. And there's actually a whole series of roads that come down from Virginia and sort of go all over the place here in the Wachovia tract that is now Winston-Salem area. There are lots and lots of roads, not that singular path that I was led to believe that there was a Great Wagon Road that came through the western part of Carolina. Looking at the trading path, this is Mosley's map again. This is the Jefferson Fry map of Virginia. And this is actually the only place that I have found where the term the Great Wagon Road to Philadelphia mentioned. So this is an extant document. It was a name that was used then. But you notice that this is part of the word Pennsylvania. As we get down into Maryland here, following this path, we see Wagon Road. Here's Philadelphia Wagon Road. And these aren't names that we think of today that is a fixed name that everyone agreed upon. But as we move further south along this same map, so this is following that same route, we now find the name, the Great Road from the Yadkin River. So again, it is still a singular road here largely. Coming down, this is the North Carolina-Virginia line. So the whole idea of this Great Philadelphia Wagon Road is a name kind of went out the window for me, and I wanted to find out where are these paths, how did travelers get into this area? So I had some extant documents, so I thought, okay, it's an easy process of tracing these roads. I also looked at some journals, so it's interesting to find other things that give you geographic clues that are not maps in and of themselves, as Rebecca told us. And this is something I just loved. This is a quote from the Reverend Schnell in 1743, who was traveling to Carolina. And he's talking in the journal that he had asked someone for directions. He said, I asked him for a way to Carolina. He told me of one which runs for 150 miles through Irish settlements, the district being known as the Irish Tract. As I had no desire to take this way, and no one could tell me the right way, I felt somewhat depressed, because I was going to have to go see the Irish. I asked the Lord to show me the right way, but slept little that night. I just find it very interesting that the perceptions of travel and roads and wayfinding at this period in the history of the Carolinas. This also really led me to believe that there is more than one way, one road that might take me places. This particular map was published in 1780, and up in the Carolinas, I don't see a lot of roads, but you come down here, this is the North Carolina-South Carolina line at the time. There are actually some roads drawn in this area down here. If I blow that up a little bit, we see that there are roads listed and houses. This is actually where Cornwallis met Gates, or was Jason Gates, top of town, and then the roads just sort of disappear. I think it's really just a lack of information about dead ends at that point. This is a detail of another map from 1779 that again shows a series of roads roughly in that same area. So this is a dividing line between North and South Carolina at the time. There's the old boundary line here. There it is. So we see lots of roads in this area that is now just in South Carolina. And this is another map from William Phaeton, who chronicled a lot of the American Revolution after the fact. And you see lots and lots of roads in this area. So I really got fascinated with this idea of understanding where the roads were, how people moved around. And now I'm not looking for just one road anymore, but I'm looking for a whole bunch of roads. And again, not willing to ask directions, how do I find the road? So my first step using GIS was to begin geo-referencing some of these historic documents. So I started with some of the very earliest maps I could find and tried to geo-register these maps, warp them a little bit, fit them to modern geography so I can begin to make sense of them. And this is just some of the maps. Interesting, some of the skewing that had to be done to fit them. The scale of the maps was tremendously different. And so the detail that you find in each map is different as well. This is a very large, the scale of this map is very large, but there's also great detail because it was physically a very large document as well. And then some maps were smaller and covered smaller areas. This is the 1770 map by Collett. And then Henry Mouzon's map of 1770s, I think it's the 1775 edition, that shows a lot of roads both in North and South Carolina. And since this had both Carolinas in it, this is actually the map that I ended up choosing as sort of a base document. One of the oldest maps, seemed fairly accurate, covered a lot of the roads that I was interested in. But I kept looking at other maps. I'm just fascinated by all these other maps. So I'm showing the full length of, or some of the length of Carolina. And then I stumbled on this map, 1796. This was a map created for the post office. What it showed was connections between cities and distances between the cities. So they're not the physical distance, point to point, but along the path that the post rider would take. And what I found very interesting is over on the right-hand side of this map, and I can blow that up a little bit. What this shows is named town by town from Maine all the way south, what cities the post office, the post rider went through, and what day of the week he was in what place. So he spent Monday here, and then traveled till Wednesday to get to the next location. Stayed there for a couple. So that's time there. And then moving on. So it's an interesting representation of the time that it took to go from city to city, and the actual distance that the post rider took. So now I thought if I could get a placement of the road, I can validate that against some historic information that tells me, here's how long the road was back then, how long it took someone to travel that. If I can find an alignment that makes sense, that has that same distance, I think that I'm onto something then. So, I had some problems with local registration. When you try registering the entire map, you find that other parts don't fit quite right. And I don't envy the work you try to do trying to get plaques to fit. But what I ended up doing is trying to do some local geo-registration. as I lifted some of the roadways off. So what I ended up doing then is reference the map as best I can, and then just digitize all the line work. This is simple, right? All I need to do now that I have it in a digital line form, is simply remove the historic document and look at the modern roadway and find that it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So I was very disappointed here. Some of this intersection here should actually be in Salisbury. You can begin looking at the map as you look closely and see some of the areas some of the intersections that should be at locations. So again, being a GIS person, I thought, okay, we'll rubber sheet these lines and we'll make them fit. So again, this is looking at the digitized line work and comparing it with other historic documents. So not only did the historic document that I began with, Mouzon's map, not agree with modern geography, it didn't agree with any other historic document as well. In actual position, and in some cases by actual shape. Some documents had more roads, some documents had less roads. One of the things I thought that was consistent would be the streams, the rivers. So I actually went to USGS and downloaded their hydrology data set, which is in a geodatabase format, and interestingly found that not only the modern geography or hydrology was there, but that the original stream channel under some of the man-made lakes was there. So I could actually drain all of the lakes with the hydrology to get back to at least the pre-lake versions of those rivers. And then assuming not a whole lot of change, some of the major rivers over a couple hundred years, I should be able to line them up. Again, I found that they did not correlate very well, not as well as I hoped they would. So that led me, I didn't wear my clothes today, but I thought I'd throw a picture in there. But that led me to begin collecting some historic surveying items and actually begin doing some surveying myself and understanding how surveying was done in the 18th century. And as Rebecca already mentioned, a lot of the measurements are not made to modern accuracy to the nearest degree. The books said to do it to the nearest 15 minutes, which is a pretty significant angle. And actually, when you look back at the historic documents, you find that they never did it to the nearest 15 minutes. They did it to the nearest degree. And measuring distances, while the chain is broken down into 100 equal lengths of 7.92 inches, they usually measure to the nearest chain, or sometimes the more accurate ones to the nearest pole. So that's 16 feet to 66 feet on distances. So there's this huge potential error in distances, huge potential error in angles, and then the lack of actually being able to go and visit all the sites that they're trying to map accounts for a lot of the errors. So I thought, how can I bring some accuracy to all of this chaos that I'm finding everywhere? I've got data out here, but it's not meaningful data at this point. So I tried to convert that. And one of the things that I stumbled across was the importance of fords. Crossing rivers at that time was a very dangerous thing to do. And it's something you try to avoid as much as possible, and when you did do it, you did it at known locations. So, okay, if fords are known, the place where we cross rivers, at least I can tie in some of the points along these linear features. We have a description here of the trading ford what crosses the Yadkin River. The Yadkin, a large, beautiful river where there is a ferry. So there's not only fords, but also ferries that become the choke points that travelers are going to have to pass through. It's nearly 300 yards over, and at this time was fordable, scarce coming to the horses' bellies. Travel was very different back then than today. 6 miles distant, we arrived in Salisbury, the county seat of Rowan, so this is a big town. It had just been laid out, the courthouse was built, and there were 7 or 8 log houses. Big town. This is Arthur Dobbs, 1755. So, trying to make sense of the hydrology. This is that USGS hydrology data set without the lakes, using the original stream channels through the lakes. I tried to line that up on this case in Collett's map to get some understanding of geography This is just another drawing by Benson Lossing of what a ford would look like, with some stones or markers along the river where to travel. This is traveling across the top of a weir or a dam. This is Great Falls in South Carolina. Hanging Rock just across the South Carolina line. Doesn't quite look like that, but you get the picture if you've ever seen the real place. And Indian villages. This is something else that I realized that was on a lot of historic maps, and that there may be some ability to locate Indian villages as these points as well. Then I stumbled across another person's work, and that was the Wells, Don and Diane Wells. And I had seen trees in the woods like this, walking around as a kid, and I thought, gee, something weird must have happened to that tree to cause that to happen. And the Wells thought the same thing, but they began to see patterns in the trees and realized that those are not natural shapes, certainly not that are going to be repeated multiple times. And what they've discovered and theorized is that these are actually markers along Indian trails that tell you where to go, that tell you where water sources are, hunting grounds, gathering grounds of different types by the way the trees are bent and are grown. So the Indians were smart enough to pick markers that would last for a long, long time and form them over time to create road markers along the way. So if we just had a collection of these points where these sorts of trees are, we know that people were walking along these areas. They were pointing to something. And it's interesting when you see that in a three-dimensional surface, how they follow the ridges fairly well. So I collected a whole series of known points. One of the sources I used was the genus dataset, the geographic name inventory system. And I simply did a search for anything that said old or historic. And I came up with a whole bunch of points. So I said these are points of interest that are historic. At one point, some roads pass by or through these points. So now I have points to take my lines to rubber sheet them to. So the red lines are my original digitized lines. The yellow lines are my rubber sheeted lines. And I thought, okay, now I've got the answer. But as I look a little closer, I realized that the roads still didn't quite make sense. They're a lot closer. And so my next step was to take, so the red again is the original digitized, yellow is rubber sheeted, so pull this intersection up to here, keeping the same sort of rough shape. But then as I looked at that, I was looking for ridge lines, minimized stream crossings, and sort of making my best guesses as to where that road actually would be aligned. So the purple lines are a lot of work on my part of trying to make sense out of how these points can connect. Now once I have that line, I can go back to the 1796 post office map and other maps that have these mileage distances to see if I've actually got something that makes sense. But I wanted to take it a step further, and I wanted to create a GIS model to predict roads forming. The first model that I created was a complete bust. I just thought about the way that I walk, and I'm trying to find the most level ground to walk on. And so I created a model that said, find a path from downtown Charlotte, headed to Chester, South Carolina, that minimized changes in elevation, changes in slope. And the DEM that I was using at the time had the lake right here. And so what the model did is sought out the surface of the water, and we walked on water down there. So it made no sense whatsoever. So I thought, okay, I'm down a bad path here, unintended. But what I did instead is I stumbled across another data set, the SUGRO data set from NRCS. This is the Soil Service data. And I thought, how can I have a proxy measure of vegetative cover? Because that's one of the things that stops you from walking through the woods, if there's a tree in the way or some dense undercover in the way. And so what I wanted to do, having a forestry background, is I thought, I'll look at the hydric soils. And that'll tell me where the wetter soils are going to be, probably the more dense vegetation. I thought it'd be a rough estimate. And so I brought in the SUGRO data, and I looked for the hydric soils. And you'll find that all the dark blue areas here are hydric soils in the Charlotte area. So Charlotte down in, this is Camden, South Carolina, and Salisbury up here. So I knew there was a major road that connected those two important colonial cities. But as I was looking through the SUGRO data, I found that there were a whole bunch of other attributes in there that were tremendously valuable. One of those, this is laying my roads, my predicted roads in pink or purple on top of the hydric soils. So the next thing that I found in the SUGRO data was a score from 0 to 1 on the limitations for paths. The USGS had, or the Soil Service had gone through and rated each soil by how good it would be for building a trail. Awesome. Now I have a relative score for each one of those. So the black areas are going to be the poorest for building paths, and the white areas are going to be the best for that. I also found another attribute called the ruttability of the soils. So now as we start getting wagons with their very narrow wheels going through areas, how easily is it going to rut out and they're going to have to move the road? And my assumption was that as they keep moving the road, they will naturally find a good soil that's more stable. What I found is that all the black areas here are the ruttable soils in that area. So they're kind of hard to avoid, especially in that most direct line between Salisbury and Camden. A little bit better if you go through Charlotte, which is a major clue for me later on. Also stream crossings. I want to try to minimize stream crossings. So in addition to some of these other values that I found in the SUGRO data, I was able to come up with a composite score between 0 and 10 that told me the suitability for my road. And I gave a score of 10 to every stream segment. So everything that is in the dark blue had a value of 10 to really say, don't cross this unless you absolutely have to. And then I composited all these scores together. So now, ranging from green, which there's not a whole lot of, that's the best place to build a road if you're going to have to build it by hand. And then the red areas are going to be the worst. So with that composite, I was able to then use the GIS to create a path for me that would predict the best way, given all of these suitabilities, to get from one point to another. And if we zoom in some, we see my purple routes along with the predicted routes that came along. So some of them lined up very well, some were slightly different. And I really, again, believe that I was on something here. So this is the methodology that I used by georeferencing some historic maps, digitizing the roads, adjusting those by rubber sheeting, aligning those, predicting the alignment, both with some interaction of my own, along with automating it and comparing the results. Now, I gave this presentation one other time down in South Carolina, and someone said to me, you know, I know where there's a road marker along the road. Would you like to see it? I thought, there's not going to be any colonial road markers anymore. But it was on my way home, so I agreed to go with them. And what I found, was this stone right here. And as I walked up to it, I thought, it's just a rock. Why does he think that's a marker? But as you get very close, and I had to read this with my fingers, there's an X and a V and a capital T, little o, capital C. And I couldn't tell if there was a 1 here or not. I thought Roman numerals, either 15 or 16 miles to Charlotte. So I quickly pulled out my GPS, got a GPS point of that stone, went back to my map, and I thought, I'm going to find out, is this 15 or 16? And how far is it from the center of Trade and Tryon to this point? I got back to my map and discovered that it was exactly 15 and a half miles from the center of Trade and Tryon along my predicted route to this point. I thought, wow, I'm within a half mile. And I thought that was awesome. I presented that at another talk, and someone told me, yeah, that's great, Dale, but did you know that stone had been moved? Great. He said, by the way, you think it's 16, it's actually 15. And I said, well, how do you know it's 15? He said, because I know where 16 is. Oh. So, and then I happened to ask, I said, well, where was the stone moved from? This stone 15. He said, it's about a half mile north on the same road, which put it right on where I had predicted the path to be and the distance to get to that path. So that made me feel very good. And there's where that point is, connecting Trade and Tryon, going down through that area, and then eventually down to Camden. The second interesting thing happened, and that was this path here. This is an eastern route that connects Salisbury to Camden. This is the western route that goes through this little place called Charlotte, certainly at the time. And I thought, well, why don't people go this eastern route as opposed to going an extra 20 miles out of their way through Charlotte? Charlotte was going to see. And I have some theories about that, and I think it has to do with the hydric soils in that area. But I thought that this road should have been over here. That would have been where I placed it near 601. And I thought, okay, there's just a problem with the model. I need to adjust it to get it to work right. But I decided before I do that, let me zoom in on that road, and found that underneath that predicted route was a little dashed line on the USGS quad maps. And I thought, there's a road there. I'm going to go drive that sometime. So I went and got on that road, and as soon as I turned onto the road right here, the road is not wide enough to have white lines down the outsides, and it didn't even have yellow lines down the middle because it was that small of a road. But immediately getting on that road, there were Victorian age houses on both sides of the road as I drove down it. I thought the only reason there's that many houses of that age along this road is because at one point this was an important path. That was an assumption on my part, but I followed it until it crossed the county line here somewhere, and the road changed name. And the name in Mecklenburg County is Old Camden Road. And that was the road that I had predicted between Salisbury headed to Camden. So that's two ways that I have